Hello, welcome to lecture number 2. I'm going to try and keep a couple days ahead of you guys for lectures, just in case you have a day where you have like a ton of extra time and you're like, ooh, I want to listen to all the lectures today. Or I told you guys for first period, if you have some time during intervention, you can take it then. So I will do my absolute best to stay ahead on lectures so that you have that option, a little bit of flexibility. Okay. 5.2, looking at in depth. So one of our mechanisms of evolution, right? So a way that species change over time is natural selections. What we talked about in lecture 1 is really when that particular trait is better fit for the nature or the environment in which it exists and therefore is more likely to be passed down. So we're going to take some more notes on natural selection. There are a couple of elements in this process that we will go over more in depth later in the year. So remember I told you that I kind of start backwards. So when we go over like the DNA portion of this process, just know that we are going to go back into it a lot. You might remember it from biology. You might have no recollection of it. So don't get too caught on the DNA, the meiosis, mitosis part for this. We're going to focus on the big picture for this unit. And then later in the year, I promise you, we'll talk more about chromosomes. Okay. Some key elements of the natural selection process that we're going to talk about in depth, but you can just go ahead and highlight these right now. Or write them down, bullet. We're going to look at variation, why that is a key part of natural selection, how overproduction of offspring plays an important part on nature selecting who survives, how a struggle to survive, meaning like there has to be some type of struggle or else there wouldn't be a better fit organism. When we stop seeing a struggle to survive, we actually stop seeing favorable characteristics being more prevalent. And then the key process of inheritance, that traits that are more survivable in our DNA, right? A certain gene that codes for a trait will be passed down. So we're going to look at those 4 elements today. Okay. All right. So the first one that's key is variation. So why variation is extremely important in environment is that allows a lot of different traits to have the ability to survive. Sometimes, right, we see situations where we don't see a lot of variation, and that's okay because there's absolutely no change in the environment. And so it's not important to be diverse. We see this sometimes with like tropical fish. Tropical fish are a great example. Sometimes if you see like the tropical fish, they've lived in this environment where the water stays the same temperature all the time. Right. So within a certain species, like they tend to look all the same, right? They have the same colors. There's not a ton of like very obvious variations with a couple exceptions. But then all of a sudden, if the temperature of the ocean changes, you don't have a lot of different characteristics or traits that might survive the temperature change. So when we don't see variation in a population, it could lead to very extinctions of species because they cannot survive environmental change. Now, natural selection only acts in places where there is variation, right? So we do not see natural selection on traits where there is not a variation, okay? Now, when we talk about variation, so a trait is and that's why in your partners, we have the phenotype partner, because a phenotype is the physical part of the trait, right? So I might have the gene that codes for green eyes, and I have the gene that codes for brown eyes, but what you see is brown eyes. So my genotype is different from my phenotype, right? Now that express trait is our phenotype, and that is what natural selection acts on. It acts on the trait that you can see. Now that going back is that variation, how I have the green and the blue, right, is for a couple different reasons. First of all, like I get half from mom, I get half from dad. Right. Another way that I might have those 2 different variation is we call it sporadic mutation, right? Something that happens for no reason. These seamless, odd mutations just happen sometimes in nature. Like we'll talk about the black moth of being a mutation. Meiosis is the process of where I get that when I get my mom's genes and my dad's genes, there's some crossing over that occurs. So I don't get the same, every egg that's made and every sperm that's made is not identical. They're all genetically different because I get crossing over of chromosomes and I get independent assortment of alleles. Just write those down for now under meiosis, because we will go back into those more in depth later in the year. And then because of sexual reproduction, meaning that there's two different sperm and egg that come together. Remember, from bacteria, there's also asexual reproduction, which is one just makes a clone of it. That happens in bacteria. But sexual reproduction is when two different sets of chromosomes meet to come together to make a new combination. Okay, so variation, natural selection can only happen when there is variation, and variation, the mechanisms of them are those three things: mutation, meiosis, and sexual reproduction. Okay, adaptations are different from inherited traits. Remember, we talked a little bit about that, right? So an adaptation is a characteristic that is acquired over many generations. Like, we use the word adaptation as like I adapted to the situation, like I adapted to the environment. But adaptations are characteristics that don't just happen like within a certain amount of time. They're ones that go over many generations. Okay. I feel like I said something wrong there in the beginning. I'll change it if I did. Those characteristics that we can see are those phenotypes, but they're passed on through our genotype, right? And those adaptations are favorable and therefore make the organism more capable of surviving in their environment. Here are some common adaptations of the polar bear. So polar bears that had thicker blubber because it was very cold were more likely to survive than polar bears that did not, right? And so over time, if I've got two polar bears that have survived because they both aren't freezing to death, they have offspring, right? They pass on those genes to their offspring. They're therefore probably have thicker blubber, right? There's some other ones on here. If you want to go through those, you can pause those. I'm going to skip over them for now because we'll look at it later. Okay. Some other things that must happen, right? The connections between natural selection is there has to be some type of struggle to survive because of overproduction, right? So if I have a lot of offspring, if there's a lot of animals and there's a limited amount of food, the animals that are best fit to get that food are going to survive. If there is no competition, then it doesn't really matter if I have a favorable trait, right? So if there is abundance amount of food, abundance amount of space, sunlight, water, if there's that, then I don't see natural selection occurring. There has to be some type of struggle to survive that would make a fate favorable. Okay, so we'll talk about some different things that can limit populations in certain areas, but for the most part, they're those things that we need: water, sunlight, food, space, and then mates, right? And the competition that occurs can be different based on what there is lacking in the environment. All right, one of the examples we'll look at are bird beaks, right? So why do beaks, you can just think about this, like, so why do beaks look different? We'll have an activity that we do in class, but what would make this beak, what in an environment would make this beak favorable over this beak? And why would animals have a, like a pointed beak versus a curved beak? Like, what in the environment makes that a favorable trait? Okay, inheritance, right? We talked about that DNA part. We're going to talk about it really quickly. I like to see there's a fork and then a spoon and then the spork and then I don't even know what that's called. That's a fun one. There you go. So this is the mechanism that allows it to be passed down. Again, if it's not an inherited trait, then it cannot be passed down. Remember, like our nose jobs. I don't know anyone that has a nose job, but okay. All right, let me keep going here. Sorry, this is not, we'll go over that in class. Okay, so overproduction, struggle to survive. All right, so we're looking at like these animals here. What do we have an overproduction of these cheetahs here, right? So there's not enough food, right? And then so we get this competition that the fastest one is going to be able to catch the food here. I seriously couldn't find the word for cheetah at the time. I'm sorry. And so we see that why we get these traits is because there is a limited amount of resources. Okay. Let me hold on just a second. Oh my gosh, I think I just paused and stopped it just 7 times. Sorry, something was coming up on my computer. Anyway, so and then the opposite of it. So these guys might be super fast because it helps them chase their prey, right? And what's the limiting? So this is the limiting factor for them. But what's the limiting factor for the antelope is are these guys, right? So protection. And so when we look at natural selection, we actually look with predator and prey, we look at two different ways it goes, right? Like what helps the prey survive, what helps the predator get the food. And oftentimes as one trait changes, that can have a change in the population, right, of the other one, right? The predator-prey relationships we'll look at a lot in our environmental unit. Okay. All right. So that natural, so going back to the mechanisms of natural selection, so showing variation, right? So think about right now, actually, with human beings, like in our population, why there is so many different varied traits. Like you can just think of here at Oakmont or like in Roseville, right? We see a lot of different skin types, heights, eyes colors, things like that. We see a ton of diversity because there's no favored trait with those types of like phenotypes, right? Having brown hair is not going to make you survive better than someone that has red hair in our environment, right? So the traits of humans are very there's a lot of diversity because there's nothing acting against it, right? So we're talking about acting against it. Versus, right, some color traits in animals can have a huge effect on their survival, whether or not they blend into their environment, right? So if I am living in an area that has more of like reddish tones of the grass around it and I need to camouflage, there is a reason why different animals have different colors because that helps them survive in their area versus all of us. Look how cute we are there. Okay. All right. It also, so going back to going back to how sexual reproduction promotes variation are the mechanisms right here, the crossing over and the independent assortment. Again, you can have this written down for this slide, right? Going back, but we won't get into the mechanisms of the different parts of meiosis there until later in the year. Okay, but we do see that this is the reason why we get those differences. If this is how it's starting, the end result is very different from how it started. So I get diversity in my DNA, therefore diversity in the population. Okay, we went through this already. Skip Mrs. Myers. There you go. All right, here we go. Yay, we'll talk about this a little bit. These are Mrs. Gullick's slides, and so I kept some of the jokes and got rid of some of them. But I do, so make a prediction. This is why I kept this one in here. If I am a green beetle and I taste better than the orange beetles, and therefore the birds will like me more, what will happen to the population of orange beetles? And what will happen to the population of green beetles, right? So there's all of a sudden a trait that actually has an effect on its survival. So make a prediction from that slide. Be prepared to talk about that in class, okay? Another part of the natural selection or why that happens when we talked about sometimes there can be a ton of variation, but it doesn't matter. We call that whole concept selective pressure. That all of a sudden there is this diversity of things, but then there is a pressure put onto the environment or the organisms living there, and that makes a trait favorable. Okay, so certain phenotypes, right, what an animal looks like, and therefore their DNA, right, have an advantage and are passed on. With the ones that are passed on more frequently are for, and the ones that are not are acted against, right? So natural selection can act for a trait and natural selection can act against a trait, okay? And so in this case, right, so I have this little chickadee that has 3 different chickens, right, and they have different colors. If there's no pressure, if those things don't have a favorable phenotype, then nothing changes. However, let's say that this particular chickadee lives in a dark forest, right? And so all of a sudden being a white animal in a very dark forest is not good for survival. So I'm acting against, and natural selection acts against this one, right? Maybe it's okay to be these 2 for now, so they get passed on, right? But then all of a sudden, like this color right here is seen more than these 2 colors, right? So you can see how the ones that natural selection is acting against are the ones that stop moving on, and natural selection is acting for are the ones that are passed on here. All right, so that's called selective pressure, and then we need to know the for and the against. Okay, again, going back to the beaks, I asked you to think about that. What would make something more important? More favorable to have? And it could be what it eats, it could be where it lives, but we'll look at that more in class. Bacteria is another thing that we talked about in last lecture, that these things happen over a very long period of time. So we see it in evidence in the fossil record or changes over time, but things like bacteria we can actually see like in real time. You can pause this and look at the joke if you'd like, antibiotic resistance. But if anyone's ever had strep throat and they had one round of antibiotics and it kind of worked, and then it came back and they gave another antibiotic, and all of a sudden that antibiotic is not working. This is called antibiotic resistance, and it's a perfect, wonderful example of natural selection. It's not wonderful that you have strep throat. I'm sorry. But it's a good real-time example of how things can change over time, natural selection. Here's how it works. Here's my normal bacteria. I give it the antibiotic because it's going against this particular protein in it, and it kills it off. But if there's a sometimes mutant, right, type of that bacteria, so it has a mutation, think of that, it's a mutant, it has a mutation, it doesn't produce that enzyme that my antibiotic is attacking. We'll talk about this later in the year too, right? So it expresses a certain protein, the antibiotic identifies that protein and it gets rid of it and it kills it. Well, my mutant here doesn't express that protein, so all of a sudden my antibiotic doesn't work. And then all of a sudden, this guy is able to reproduce. And so therefore, the antibiotic does not work on this certain bacteria strain anymore. Again, we're seeing this right now with our virus that's changing, right? The Delta variant versus the Alpha variant. With viruses, a whole different deal you'll learn about later. But as it changes, the things that we know about it change as well, right? It mutates over time. Okay. All the rest of them joke. The rest of them are jokes. Yay. Okay. We are all done. Looking at how favorable body types over time we can talk a little bit about, but why our bodies hang on to fat, right? Why they store fat? Well, because for the most of time, right, we did not have an abundance of food. So it was very important to be able to hold on to resources and nutritions to have in times when it was not prevalent. Right now in our society, not for everyone, but for the most part, we see enough food, right? But our bodies have held on to that ability or want to keep the nutrients in there, even though there's an abundance of it. And therefore we see sometimes we're holding on to weight when we don't necessarily need it to survive anymore, right? So sometimes our environments change faster than our DNA's ability to catch up with it. Okay. All right. We'll talk about these a little bit more tomorrow in class. Have a fabulous night.